It's just another Meta Monday. Oh, it's a data is fun day. Welcome back to Meta Monday. So we had a little bit off of doing Meta Monday reviews, but we've got some information to look at. So this past weekend we had a number of tournaments that were the standard 2022 format, and only the Hooglandia Open, which if you missed the coverage of that, you can find full video archive of that here on the YouTube channel, Hold the Downtime Cut Out. But Insight Esports also had several events ranging from their paid tournaments to a free tournament that they ran. So we've got an approximately 600 match sample size of standard 2022 deck lists to look at here. And after playing in one of those tournaments and then casting one of those tournaments, the results of this don't really surprise me all that much. So, Izzet Dragons was the most played deck in all of these events by a pretty significant margin. And that doesn't surprise me for a couple of reasons. The first is that the Izzet Dragons deck is probably the deck that ports most cleanly from the existing 8-set standard format. It lost the least important cards while keeping, most of its key players to keep its power level up. And we can see here, it had a very reasonable win rate overall. But when we dig into the matchup matrix here, we can see that it had quite strong matchups against a number of things, most notably being very strong against the other category. Now, that being said, the number 2 deck in the room, Mono Green Stompy, I think is easy to say that was kind of the talk of the weekend, looking at all the events and the results that came out of it. They had a very strong win rate across everything, and notably had a incredible win rate into the Izzet Dragons deck. And for people not familiar, the mono green deck looks a little bit like this, and it's basically got a number of chunky creatures in it, such as Old Growth Troll and Azeka's Chariot especially, that allow this archetype to be really resilient to things like Frostbite out of the Izzet Dragons deck, which is their primary form of removal. So things to note in here. Also very strong into the other category. So the question in my mind from a balance perspective, like we've often talked about in the past, is Izzet Dragons kind of popped up and kind of was the deck on people's radar, knowing going into the first couple events that, hey, this is one of the decks you should be ready for. And a bunch of people metagamed that appropriately with this mono green Stompy deck and were able to be very successful against it. So these metagame numbers could change or equalize a little bit. And the thing that I always personally look at is, as the metagame develops, does this crazy high win rate stay crazy high once the deck is a known entity? So for example, there's a 2-mana red instant in the D&D set that says deal 6 damage to a creature for just 2 mana if it's green. So the Izzet Dragons, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if they start packing stuff like that as sideboard cards to have meaningful counterplay against the Stompy deck, which could maybe drag this metric back up. But other things to consider too is, as these Izzet Dragons decks have to start respecting other metagame players, their win rates against other things that they're beating up could change, because they have to adjust their deck slightly to be better into some other things. Looking at other things here that were being played, not super surprised to see other aggressive decks potentially doing well. It is worth noting, you'll note we've got green and red coloring here, and these are white in the middle. These are indicative of the sample sizes that these things have. So you can note a lot of these have very small numbers of decks, which leads to a small number of matches played. So the confidence with which we can say, well, Dimir Control had a mediocre win rate is low because of the sample size that we are looking at. But again, generically, it doesn't surprise me to see decks that are in the aggro category doing well at the very start of a format. Something to note is that the other category, man, it just got trashed by basically every aggressive deck. And that also doesn't surprise me, because people hate respecting aggressive decks and their deck building in my experience. So when you're early on in a format like this and people don't have net decks to copy, they are, generally speaking, not putting enough respect into their sideboards or into their primary game plan for being able to stay alive against aggressive decks. Now, past this this data, I'd also like to take a quick peek at, we had some historic tournaments this week with the AFR cards. And historic is kind of more of the same in a lot of ways. So Phoenix is, I would like to asterisk here again, sample sizes. We only had a few insight things to look at and a couple other smaller tournaments. This is only 280 matches total looked at. But for yet again, Izzet Phoenix is both the most played archetype in the field. It is the known best deck going into these tournaments, and it is still just putting up absurd win rates. And this, in my opinion, is the #1 giant red flag that something needs to be addressed in the format. So this is different than something like Mono Green Stompy, where this is week 1 of a format and people didn't know this deck existed, and we want to give the format to see if it can adjust in equilibrium naturally. But we've been seeing Izzet Phoenix as the most, or one of the most popular decks for the better part of a month now. We've had tons of games played and matches played through various tournaments, and it's had very strong win rates over a very sustained portion of time. The metagame does not have the tools it needs to be able to adjust to the Phoenix deck. The consistency with which the Phoenix deck is able to execute its game plan, thanks to cards like Expressive Iteration and Brainstorm, are just a cut above everything else in the format. Now, something that is interesting to note here, the second most played deck this weekend was Jund Food. Apologies, I had tiny children rattling at my door. So Jund Food was the second most played deck, and it had a very strong win rate as well. And I think that this makes a lot of sense because in previous weeks, we had seen this fourth most played deck here, Auras, popping up in popularity. And the food deck, the sacrifice decks, were one of the things that kept the Auras deck kind of down for a while. And I would wager to guess that this high win rate and this low win rate are very, very related to each other. The one thing that jumped out at me as, oh, Bant midrange, that's not something I'm familiar with. And then I clicked over to take a look at the sample list, and the Bant midrange deck is basically just a more proactive iteration of just blue-white or Jeskai control that we looked at. It's kind of interesting that this has popped up. The Yasharn Implacable Earth is a card that we saw these blue-white control decks splashing in previous iterations when Jund Food was more popular. So the metagame has been a little bit cyclical among these top decks, but not in any sort of way that allows you to touch Izzet Phoenix's dominance. And something else we've called out before is, I believe it was one of the first or second Meta Monday breakdowns that I did after the Strixhaven had released with the archives, we talked about the other category. And while the other category has a very healthy metagame percentage, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so these 6 most played decks only represent, 57% of the field. The other category is just does not have the tools to be competitive. And while obviously there's some things in here that have good weekends and bad weekends, on average, this experience here has been my experience kind of brewing and working inside of Historic currently, in that Historic feels very hostile to brewing because the power level of a number of these things, especially the Brainstorm Memory Lapse decks, are just a cut above what else you can be doing in the format, and the range of cards that are playable that you got to work outside the box with feels a little bit stressed. One other thing I'd like to take a peek at is we had Dimir Control here, as this is not a Memory Lapse deck, it would look like, but it is kind of, Brainstorm, ways to shuffle your Brainstorm so your deck's just more consistent than everything else, just more of the blue dabba dee dabba die, for the lack of a better phraseology. At any rate, this was Meta Monday. Let me know in the comment section down below, do you like when I cover multiple formats in here? Would you prefer that I keep these videos just to a single format, or is it worth looking at all the formats I'm currently following? For the number of first few videos, I really wasn't following standard at all, and I'm not following standard proper at all, but we have been playing a lot of standard 22 on the stream, and I've been enjoying it, so I wanted to look at that. But let me know if you think I should segment these out and do historic and standard 22 separate, or if we're a little bit of a quick breakdown of both of them here like I did was fine. So thanks for watching. I'll be back tomorrow morning with some more modern into standard 22 into historic on stream. Thanks for watching, folks.